I hear questions like it all the time. Ben, how do you make your videos look so good? Ben, where did you go to school to learn how to make those amazing videos? Ben, what camera settings should I use to make my videos look like yours? Okay, for real, I don't hear questions like that all the time. Every once in a while, but not like, every day or something. But I have worked for years to improve the image you see in my videos. If you have a DSLR, but you don't know much about the different settings and how they affect the quality of your shot, hopefully a peek behind the scenes of my production will provide some new insights and boost your camera confidence. Ahead, I'm going to walk you through the settings I use on my Panasonic GH5, many of which can be adjusted on just about any DSLR. In fact, for the thumbnail image, I'm holding my Canon, which is not a GH5, but a lot of the same settings can be adjusted on this as well. So if you have a DSLR, chances are this video will help you. So some of what you see in the final image has to do with which lens I use, the camera's sensor, lights, and color correction that I apply in post. But for any of those things to work well, I first have to tune the settings of my camera to produce an image I can work with. So let's dive in. Frame rate. Frame rate is the number of frames recorded each second. Most cameras allow you to choose between 24, 30, or 60 frames per second, with more advanced cameras giving you even more options. I always set my camera to record at 24 frames per second, and I'll explain why. Back in the 90s, when tape-based camcorders ruled the consumer video market, you could almost always tell a video was homemade because there was something just a little off about the motion. That's because old camcorders mostly recorded in 30 or 60 frames per second. 24 frames per second was chosen as the standard by the film and TV industry because the motion at 24 frames per second just looks more natural. It's still a topic of debate among video creators, but I personally just like the way 24 FPS looks. Ultimately, you have to be the one to choose what you think looks best for your videos. It's 24. Shutter speed. Shutter speed affects the amount of light coming into each frame and the amount of motion blur. When the shutter speed is higher, each frame is exposed for a shorter duration of time, which means less light and less motion blur. When it's lower, each frame is exposed for a longer duration of time, which means more light and more motion blur. The human eye naturally sees a bit of motion blur, so in most cases, you want to emulate that in your videos. A general rule of thumb is for the denominator of your shutter speed to be about double your frame rate. So if your frame rate is 24, you'd set your shutter speed to 1/50th. If your frame rate is 30, you'd set your shutter speed to 1/60th, and so on. Exceptions are made for sports footage or action sequences where the frame rate is often set higher to convey a sense of kinetic motion. But in most cases, you want to follow the rule of thumb to keep your motion as natural as possible. Because I set my frame rate to 24 FPS, I keep my shutter speed at 1/50th. Aperture or f-stop. The aperture is the size of the opening in the lens through which the light enters. The lower the f-stop, the wider the aperture, and the more light is allowed in. The higher the f-stop, the smaller the aperture, and the less light is allowed in. The size of the opening also affects the focal length. A wider opening creates a shallower depth of focus, making things that are out of focus more blurry. A smaller opening creates a deeper depth of focus, making everything in the shot appear more in focus. I usually keep my f-stop as low as possible because I usually need the extra light, and I also like the feeling of depth created when the background is blurry compared to the subject. I currently use a 2.8 f-stop, which is the lowest on my lens, but I'd go lower if I could. I would just have to buy an expensive lens first, and the one I want is like $1,300. ISO. ISO is also responsible for the amount of light coming into your shot. I almost always leave the previous 3 settings alone, but I'll adjust the ISO when it comes to controlling how bright or dark my shot is. On the GH5, you can set your ISO to automatic, and you can also set an upper limit. This means the camera will automatically adjust the ISO to make sure that the shot is properly lit, but the ISO will not go higher than what you set the upper limit. I find that using automatic makes the shot a little bit too bright, so most of the time I just set it myself. Here in the studio, I usually keep the ISO at 200 or 250 depending on my lighting setup. Another thing to remember about ISO is that the higher it is, the more noise you might see in your shot. Adding extra light sources to your scene can allow you to use a lower ISO and avoid noisy shots. Photo style. On the GH5, like most DSLR cameras, there's a photo style setting that lets you choose between different looks for your video. These styles act as a sort of built-in color correction. Some cameras come with, or you can buy what's called a flat profile and load it onto your camera. For the GH5, it's called Vlog-L, and it's a popular style because it collects more image data, which gives you more control over how the finished video looks. So obviously I use that one, right? Actually, no. Most of the time I use the standard photo style. It's the closest to what I'd use Vlog to produce without the extra work of adding and tweaking color correction. I make a lot of videos, so in this case, I prioritize good quality and speed over perfect quality and not speed or being slow. But I don't just use the standard style as is. I actually adjust the color in the camera first, which brings me to my next setting, white balance. White balance has to do with the tint and temperature of your shot. Tint ranges between red tones and green tones, while temperature ranges between warmer or yellow tones and cooler or blue tones. When shooting talking head videos, I use a custom white balance that pushes the tones a little bit more toward the reds and brings the color temperature down into the yellows. Your white balance setting is heavily dependent on where you're shooting. In this particular environment, my adjustments work well, but if I take it downstairs into a room that's a little bit brighter, has more natural sunlight, those settings don't work, and I have to use one of the existing presets or create a new custom one. It's always a good idea to create custom white balance profiles if you can, especially if you're going to be shooting in the same location often. Resolution. I almost always shoot in 4K resolution. The only exception is if I'm trying to get some super slow motion shots. The GH5 can only go up to 60 frames per second at 4K resolution, but can go as high as 180 frames per second at 1080p resolution. At that speed, you can almost see a bee's wings flap. Manual or autofocus. As much as I'd love to put my focus on auto and just forget about it, I'm still wary of the GH5's previous issues with autofocus. I hear that firmware updates have fixed issues like random focus finding and slow focus. I could probably dial in the settings and it would be perfect 95% of the time. But when it's time to record, I don't want to be worrying about whether or not the camera is keeping me in focus, so I just set it myself. Then I know I could leave the frame and come back and I'll still be in focus. Zoom. I mostly use a 12 to 35 millimeter lens and set it to about 18 millimeters. This gives me a wide enough view while still allowing for some depth in the shot. So those are all the settings I use on my DSLR to get the shot that you're seeing now. If you have a DSLR, I highly encourage you to take the time and learn about each of these settings and how to adjust them on your camera. It's helped me push the quality of my videos even further. And I even apply some of this knowledge when shooting with my iPhone, and I end up with better footage than I would have just using the default settings. I hope this glimpse into the settings I use helps you figure out what will work best for the videos you're trying to create. Are there any settings that I didn't mention in this video that you'd like me to cover in a future video? Leave a comment and let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.